Ava had always been someone who knew the importance of staying focused. Today, she was getting ready for a business trip that would take her far from home. As she walked through the airport, she could feel the rush of excitement mixed with the usual pressure of the work that awaited her. She checked in, barely glancing at the crowd around her mind already thinking about the meetings and the decisions that had to be made at her destination. She was used to juggling 1,000 things at once, and she could handle it all. While she went through security, her phone buzzed with reminders. Her briefcase was packed with reports, and she mentally checked off everything she needed. She had no time to waste, and she wasn't one to entertain distractions. Ava was the kind of woman who could handle pressure with grace, and her calm demeanor often made her seem unshakable. A few steps ahead of her, a flight attendant walked briskly through the terminal. She wore a neat blue uniform, and her name tag read Emily. Ava didn't pay much attention at first, but as she got closer to the boarding gate, she noticed Emily's eyes linger on her for a moment longer than usual. Ava thought nothing of it, focusing on the task at hand. As Ava approached the gate, she checked her ticket. Business class. It was standard for someone of her position to fly in comfort, especially for a trip of this importance. She smiled to herself, thinking of how far she had come. Business class was a nice perk of the job, but it wasn't something she flaunted. Ava had always preferred to keep a low profile. When it was time to board, Ava stood in line and waited her turn, still buried in her thoughts. Emily, who had been standing by the boarding counter, now moved toward Ava. The flight attendant offered a polite smile, but Ava couldn't help but feel something wasn't quite right. Emily's smile didn't reach her eyes, and there was something in the way she scanned Ava up and down that made Ava pause. When it was Ava's turn to show her ticket, Emily glanced at it before looking back at her. "Excuse me, miss, but I think you're in the wrong line," she said, her voice firm, almost judgmental. Ava looked up, confused. Emily continued, "Business class is over there," pointing to a different section of the plane. Ava frowned slightly. She had been flying business class for years, and the way Emily had spoken to her felt off. She wasn't sure if it was because of her attire or maybe something else, but it stung. "No, I'm in the right place," Ava replied, her voice calm, but with a hint of disbelief. Emily didn't seem to hear her, though. She kept glancing at the boarding pass in her hand, and then at Ava with what seemed like a silent judgment. Ava stood there, feeling uncomfortable but refusing to show it. She had dealt with far worse in her career, and she wasn't about to let a small moment like this throw her off course. She smiled, a polite but firm smile, and said nothing more as she moved past Emily and toward the business class cabin. Ava could feel the eyes of the flight attendants on her as she walked down the aisle, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she sat down in her seat, taking a deep breath. It was only the beginning of what would be a long flight, and she wasn't going to let one person's mistake get in her way. Ava had dealt with far worse in her career. She had learned to rise above those who made assumptions about her based on her appearance, but it wasn't always easy. Still, she kept going, knowing that there was always something more important to focus on than the opinions of others. Ava settled into her seat, the familiar hum of the airplane surrounding her. She glanced out of the window, watching as the ground seemed to fade away beneath them. The excitement of the trip was still there, but it was mixed with a hint of annoyance at the earlier interaction. She let out a small sigh, adjusting the seatbelt around her, and pulling out the reports she needed to go over. The quiet of the cabin felt peaceful compared to the rush of the airport. As she flipped through the documents, she could feel the weight of the day's events already pressing on her. Meetings, decisions, deadlines, the usual whirlwind that had become her life. But she always handled it with ease. She had learned to juggle 1,000 tasks without breaking a sweat, and today would be no different. A few moments passed, and Ava was just getting into the rhythm of her work when the sound of footsteps caught her attention. She looked up to see Emily, the same flight attendant who had earlier mistaken her for someone out of place. Emily was walking down the aisle, checking on passengers as part of her usual duties. She stopped by Ava's seat, giving her a quick, polite smile. "Is everything all right, miss?" Emily asked, her voice warm, though Ava could still sense a hint of coldness behind it. It was almost as if she was going through the motions, not truly paying attention to Ava, but instead following a checklist. "Yes, everything is fine," Ava replied, returning the smile with one of her own, though it felt a little strained. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't help but notice that Emily's tone seemed almost forced, like she was pretending to be courteous. As the flight continued, Emily came by again, this time offering drinks. When she reached Ava's row, she paused for a moment longer than necessary, eyeing Ava as if she was trying to decide something. "Would you like a drink, miss?" she asked. There was a slight pause before she added, "Something special, perhaps?" Ava raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. It wasn't an offer she had ever heard before. Most flight attendants simply asked what passengers wanted, without the extra flair. She could feel Emily's eyes on her again. And this time, the judgment seemed even more obvious. It was as if Emily was sizing her up, still questioning her presence in business class. "I'll have a water, please," Ava responded, keeping her tone polite, but no longer smiling. She wasn't going to let Emily's attitude affect her more than it already had. Emily nodded, though she didn't seem fully satisfied with the answer. She quickly moved on, serving the other passengers around Ava before disappearing toward the back of the plane. Ava shook her head slightly, feeling the sting of the subtle judgment from the flight attendant. It was one of those situations where everything felt just a little off, but it wasn't enough to make a scene about. Still, it bothered her. She had worked hard to get to where she was in life, and she wasn't about to let someone's assumptions undermine that. As the flight went on, Ava found herself lost in her thoughts. She didn't usually let things like this get under her skin, but there was something about the way Emily had treated her that didn't sit right. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was a businesswoman, someone who had earned every part of her journey. Yet here she was, being treated as if she didn't belong. But Ava wasn't the kind of person to back down. She wouldn't let one person's mistaken assumptions define her, no matter how small the incident seemed. She knew that in the end, the only opinion that truly mattered was her own. As the flight continued, Ava couldn't help but think about the incident with the flight attendant. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. In fact, she had experienced similar situations throughout her life, both in her career and personal life. Being a black woman in a high-powered position often brought a certain level of scrutiny that she wasn't always prepared for. It wasn't just about her abilities. Sometimes, it felt like people only saw the surface and made assumptions based on that. Ava had worked hard to get where she was, and every step of the way had been a challenge. She wasn't born with privileges that some others had. Her journey had been full of obstacles, but she never let them stop her. From a young age, she had learned that success wasn't just handed to anyone. It had to be earned through hard work, determination, and sometimes a little bit of resilience in the face of adversity. Growing up, Ava was always told that she needed to work harder than everyone else to prove herself. At first, that thought bothered her. Why should she have to work harder just because of the way she looked? But as she got older, she realized that those challenges only made her stronger. They forced her to push beyond her limits, to be more than just a person in the room. She had to be the best at everything she did, not just to succeed, but to be recognized for it. Her career had followed a similar path. Ava had started in entry-level positions, working her way up the corporate ladder. She had been underestimated by many, overlooked because of her appearance or the way she spoke. But every time someone doubted her, she used it as motivation. She wasn't going to let anyone define what she could or couldn't do. She had learned to push through the doubts, ignore the whispers, and focus on the work that mattered. When she had finally reached a leadership position in her company, Ava had earned the respect of those who had once doubted her. She was known for her sharp mind, her ability to negotiate and close deals, and most importantly, for her integrity. Her reputation preceded her, But even with all the success, she still faced moments like the one on the plane, where people would look at her and assume she didn't belong. It was exhausting, but it was also something she had grown used to. Eva couldn't let these small moments distract her. The world wasn't always going to be fair, and she had learned long ago that she couldn't change the way people thought, but she could control how she responded. Today, the incident with Emily was nothing more than another reminder that some people would always judge others based on preconceived ideas. But Ava wasn't the kind of person to let it shake her. Instead of allowing the situation to ruin her mood, Ava focused on her work. She reviewed her reports, made notes, and prepared for the meetings ahead. It was a reminder that no matter what anyone thought of her, she was in charge of her own narrative. She had worked too hard to let a fleeting moment of ignorance define her. As the plane soared through the sky, Ava sat back in her seat, knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, in control of her destiny, confident and unshaken by the opinions of others. As the flight progressed, Ava's mind wandered to her work and the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the many challenges she had faced and how she had overcome them. It hadn't always been easy, but she had built a successful career through sheer determination, intelligence, and persistence. Every step had been a result of hard work, and every accomplishment was earned. But even with all the progress she had made, moments like these, where people assumed things based on her appearance, still stung. She remembered her first job out of college, how she had been excited to prove herself. Ava had entered a competitive industry where the odds were stacked against her. As a young black woman, she had been constantly overlooked in meetings, her ideas ignored simply because of how she looked. But she had always known that if she wanted to succeed, she couldn't let those challenges stop her. Instead, she learned to make her voice heard. Over time, Ava started to gain recognition. She was known for her sharp thinking and ability to solve problems in creative ways. Colleagues began to see her as someone who could get things done. She pushed herself harder than anyone, staying late to perfect her work, never settling for mediocrity. But as much as she achieved, there were still those who questioned her abilities, who saw only her race or her gender and assumed that she didn't belong in the room. She had been overlooked for promotions, her potential underestimated. But with every failure came a lesson, and with every lesson came growth. Ava began to realize that she wasn't just competing against others in her field. She was also fighting against the bias that people carried without even knowing it. This wasn't just about being the best at what she did. It was about showing everyone that she belonged there, no matter what they assumed about her. But Ava had learned something important along the way. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She didn't have to explain why she belonged in business class, why she deserved respect, or why she had earned her place at the table. The proof was in her work, in the results she delivered, and in the way people came to her for advice and solutions. She had worked hard, she had earned everything she had, and her success spoke for itself. Yet, moments like the one with Emily still had the power to shake her. It was a small incident in the grand scheme of things, but it made her realize that, despite all her achievements, some people would always judge her based on assumptions. Ava was no stranger to this kind of bias, but it still hurt. She had worked so hard to be seen for her skills, not her appearance. But in a world where people still made judgments based on the way you looked, it was a constant battle. Despite the frustration, Ava wasn't about to let one flight attendant's actions define her. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that she had come too far to let something so small disrupt her peace of mind. She had bigger things to focus on, and she knew she was on the path to greater success. The flight might have been a small part of her journey, but Ava was determined to stay focused on the bigger picture, as always. As the flight continued, Ava found herself staring out of the window, her thoughts lingering on the conversation with Emily. It had started as a small interaction, but the more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. She had dealt with these types of situations her entire life, but every time it happened, it still felt unfair. The assumptions, the judgments, Sometimes they felt like they weighed heavier than they should. But Ava wasn't the type to let these things get to her for long. She was determined to handle it in her own way, just like she always had. She had learned to rise above the stereotypes placed on her. Throughout her career, she had been underestimated by so many, especially early on. People would look at her and assume she was just another young woman of color trying to make it in a tough industry. But Ava had a secret weapon. She was smart, resourceful, and unafraid to work harder than anyone else. She had come a long way from those early days, but the path had never been easy. Ava had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce. Her family had taught her the value of hard work, but they had also shown her the importance of being proud of who she was. They had made sure she understood that no matter what anyone else thought, she had something valuable to offer. And that was a lesson Ava carried with her every day. In her first job, she had to fight for every opportunity. There had been plenty of moments when her ideas were brushed aside, simply because of how she looked. But instead of letting that stop her, she pushed harder. She spent extra hours perfecting her work, making sure that when she presented her ideas, they couldn't be ignored. She had learned how to make herself heard, even when others tried to drown her out. Over time, things started to change. She became a force to be reckoned with in the office, and her colleagues began to see her as someone who could get things done. She was promoted, given more responsibility, and eventually, she found herself in charge of major projects. But even with all the success she had earned, there were still those who underestimated her. It was like no matter how far she went, she had to constantly prove that she deserved to be there. Now, sitting on this plane, the events with Emily reminded Ava of just how much work was still left to do. She wasn't angry at the flight attendant. She knew that Emily was just a product of her own biases, a person who had been raised to believe certain things about the world. But it still hurt. The assumption that she didn't belong in business class, that she was somehow out of place, it stung. Ava wasn't the type to back down. She had dealt with far worse in her career. There had been times when she had been passed over for promotions, her talents ignored in favor of others. But she had always come out stronger on the other side. She had learned that her worth wasn't determined by the opinions of others. It was determined by the work she did and the results she achieved. As the plane continued its journey, Ava made a decision. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She had too much to focus on, too many important things ahead of her. This wasn't going to be the thing that held her back. She was going to rise above it, just like she always had. And by the time the flight ended, she would have already moved on, knowing that this was just another small hurdle she had overcome. It was nothing compared to the bigger challenges she had faced and conquered throughout her life. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, Ava settled back in her seat, her mind still lingering on the earlier incident with Emily. But despite the discomfort she had felt, she didn't allow it to consume her. She had been through worse. This moment, however irritating, was just a fleeting part of her long journey. Ava was determined not to let one person's narrow view cloud her focus on the bigger picture. But deep down, she knew it was time to address what had happened. Eventually, Emily passed by again, making her rounds through the cabin. This time, she seemed more careful, more aware of her surroundings. Ava had noticed that Emily had been more polite and even had a slight air of nervousness in her demeanor. Ava saw this as an opportunity to address the issue, calmly and directly. She wasn't going to make a scene, but she also wasn't going to let the situation go unspoken. As Emily approached, Ava caught her eye, and for a moment, the flight attendant hesitated. Ava gave her a small, but firm, smile. "Excuse me, Emily," Ava said, her voice calm but carrying an underlying strength. "I'd like to talk about something from earlier, if you have a moment." Emily looked visibly surprised, but she nodded and stopped. She had clearly expected Ava to let it go, but now that she had been called out, she realized this was not going to be a quiet confrontation. Ava took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I understand that sometimes people make assumptions about others based on what they see on the outside. Ava began, keeping her tone neutral yet direct. But I want you to understand that when you assumed I didn't belong in business class, that was based on your own ideas about who I am, not on who I actually am. It's important to recognize that people should not be judged by their appearance or by assumptions. Emily's face turned slightly red as she listened. Ava could tell she was uncomfortable, but she wasn't looking for an apology at this moment. What she wanted was understanding. I've worked very hard to get to where I am in life, Ava continued, her voice steady. I didn't get here because of luck. I faced challenges every step of the way, challenges that others don't always see. It's important that we remember to treat everyone with respect, regardless of what we think we know about them. Emily seemed to take in every word, her shoulders visibly relaxing as she processed what Ava was saying. It wasn't the kind of conversation that Emily had expected, and Ava could see that she was starting to understand the impact of her actions. I didn't mean to offend you, Emily finally said, her voice much softer now. I'm really sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable. That was never my intention. Ava gave her a nod, acknowledging the apology without holding on to any anger. I know it wasn't intentional, but it's important to learn from these moments. It's about treating people with dignity and respect, no matter who they are. For a moment, there was a silence between them. Ava could see that Emily was reflecting on what she had said. Ava wasn't looking for an apology out of obligation. She wanted Emily to understand why this mattered. The world could be full of assumptions and biases, but it was how we chose to handle those moments that truly mattered. Thank you for listening, Ava said finally, her voice calm. I appreciate it. Emily nodded again, a sincere expression on her face. She gave Ava a small, respectful smile and moved on to the other passengers. Ava watched her go, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't let the situation fester or build into something larger than it needed to be. Instead, she had handled it with grace, the same way she handled everything else in her life, with dignity. Ava wasn't angry anymore. She had said what needed to be said, and she could move on from it now. There were bigger challenges ahead, more important things to focus on. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of the conversation lifting off her shoulders. As the hours passed and the plane sailed through the sky, Ava felt a sense of calm wash over her. The conversation with Emily had been brief, but impactful. She had spoken her truth without raising her voice, without creating a scene, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The flight attendant had listened, and that was all she could ask for. Ava knew that sometimes it wasn't about confrontation or retaliation. Sometimes it was simply about making sure your voice was heard in the right way. The rest of the flight was uneventful. Ava returned to her work, reviewing the reports for her upcoming meetings, making notes in the margins, and preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. She didn't allow herself to get distracted. She had a clear purpose, and she knew that every minute spent worrying about small things would take away from the time she needed to focus on what really mattered. The work she had to do was more important than the small irritation she had felt earlier, and she reminded herself of that constantly. It was a quiet reminder that, in the grand scheme of things, moments of discomfort or misunderstanding were just that, small moments. They came and went, but how she chose to handle them would determine the course of her day, and perhaps even her future. She had learned to be resilient, to not let these tiny bumps along the road derail her. The road ahead was long, and she had already overcome much larger obstacles in her life. As the flight began its descent, Ava looked out of the window again, watching as the land below slowly came into view. The city where her meetings awaited her looked peaceful from above, a stark contrast to the busy, chaotic world that she would soon enter once again. But Ava didn't mind. She thrived in that world of constant movement and decision-making. She had always been at home in it, no matter how overwhelming it could sometimes be. The seatbelt sign illuminated, signaling that they were preparing to land. Ava tightened her seatbelt and closed her laptop, feeling a sense of satisfaction. She had done everything she could to prepare for this trip. Now, it was time to move forward. There was no time for looking back, no time to dwell on past frustrations. Life was about the next step, the next challenge, and Ava was always ready for whatever came her way. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Ava thought about her earlier conversation with Emily. She had said everything she needed to say. Now, it was up to the flight attendant to reflect on it and hopefully learn from the experience. Ava wasn't expecting a change overnight, but she knew that every conversation like that, every moment of speaking up, had the potential to make a difference. When the plane finally came to a stop, Ava gathered her things. She stood up, stretching her legs as the other passengers began to disembark. She didn't look for Emily as she passed through the cabin, but a small part of her hoped that the flight attendant had taken her words to heart. People were all capable of growth, of learning. Ava believed in that. With a final glance around the cabin, Ava stepped off the plane and into the airport, ready to take on whatever came next. The incident with Emily had been a small moment, but it reminded her of something important. No matter where she went, no matter who she met, she would always handle things with the same strength, grace, and dignity that had gotten her to this point. The future was hers, and she was ready for it. As Ava walked through the bustling airport, she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that always came with landing in a new city. The wheels of the plane had barely touched the ground, but her mind was already focused on the upcoming meetings, the decisions she would need to make, and the work that lay ahead. Her pace quickened as she moved through the crowd, her thoughts pulling her back to the tasks she had prepared for, but there was still a lingering thought in the back of her mind. The conversation she had with Emily. Even as the busy airport surrounded her, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of her own strength. She hadn't let the small moment of discomfort from earlier weigh her down. Instead, she had turned it into an opportunity to speak up, to educate, and to remind someone else that respect and understanding mattered, no matter the situation. Ava knew that she wasn't the only one who had been through moments like this, where assumptions were made and judgments passed without any real understanding. People often didn't realize how their actions could affect others, how a simple moment could stay with someone long after it had ended. But she had chosen not to let that moment define her. She had taken the higher road, and in doing so, had shown that true strength was in how you handled things, not how others treated you. She made her way to the taxi stand, already thinking about the first meeting she would have once she reached her hotel. The city outside the windows was alive, full of energy and possibilities. Ava had always thrived in these environments. The fast pace, the constant challenges, and the need for quick decisions were all things she was accustomed to. She had been in situations much more stressful than this, and yet, today, she felt a sense of peace. As she got into the taxi, the driver greeted her politely, and Ava settled into the back seat, staring out the window as the city unfolded around her. She had come a long way from where she had started, and she knew the path ahead would not always be easy. There would always be challenges, always people who underestimated her, but none of that could take away what she had achieved. She had earned her place, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The taxi ride was short, and soon they arrived at her hotel. Ava stepped out and walked through the lobby, her heels clicking on the marble floors as she approached the check-in counter. She was checked in quickly, and as she made her way to the elevator, she couldn't help but think about the small encounter with Emily again. While it wasn't the most significant event of her trip, it had reminded her of something important, that she had the power to make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. Later that evening, as she prepared for the next day's meetings, Ava felt a renewed sense of confidence. She had faced a moment of discomfort and had handled it with grace. She had stood up for herself, not in anger, but in a calm, measured way that allowed her to remain in control. She knew that the world could be full of biases, but it was up to her to rise above them. With everything set for the next day, Ava sat back in the hotel room, feeling content. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but she was ready. She had made it this far because of who she was, and nothing would change that. The future was full of possibilities, and she was determined to take it on with the same strength and poise that had brought her this far. Every challenge, every moment of doubt, was just another opportunity to prove that she could handle anything life threw her way.